This is the retro release I've been waiting for. I liked the Mini a lot, even though it wasn't perfect, I still think it's a great little device, but the Retroid Pocket 5 was the one I knew could be special. Now unfortunately, we don't have the final retail release of software just yet, so this won't be a definitive review, but we are going to look at a lot of things from current performance, kind of get an idea of what to expect from the RP5, and talk about the hardware because a lot of these things are finalized. It's just a couple things that need to be ironed out. All that being said, let's get into it because there's a lot to cover in this video. Let's start with the price and the specs. Quick disclaimer, Retroid sent me this unit in for a review, but they haven't seen this video and all opinions are my own. The Retroid Pocket 5 retails for $219 USD, it runs at Android 13 with support for Rocknix and Batocera. Here's the hardware. It has a Snapdragon 865 with an Adreno 650 GPU, 128GB of internal storage expandable with a microSD card, 8GB of LPDDR4 RAM, a 5.5-inch 1920 by 1080 60Hz AMOLED screen, 5000 mAh battery, active cooling, Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.1, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and video out over USB-C. Next, let's look at the battery life, and I ran the same battery test as with the Mini, Wi-Fi on, screen brightness at 50%, and here's what I found. Starting off with Final Fantasy VI on the GBA in standard mode with the fan off, after 1 hour of gameplay I lost 6% battery. With Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast at a 2x resolution in standard mode with the fan on smart, I lost 6% battery after 1 hour. For PSP, God of War Chains of Olympus at a 3x resolution with the fan on smart mode, I lost 12% battery. For Gamecube, playing Wind Waker at a 2x resolution, performance mode, fan smart, I lost 14% battery. And finally for PS2, playing Jak and Daxter at a 2x resolution and high performance mode with the fan on sport mode, I lost 18% battery after 1 hour. The battery drain is pretty much the same as what I saw on the RP Mini, and that's not really all that surprising because we have a much bigger, higher resolution display that, at least in my eye, gets a lot brighter. So them basically having the same battery life, even though it is a higher capacity one, it doesn't really surprise me that much. For the less demanding games, you can expect well over 10 hours. With the more demanding stuff like high-end PlayStation 2 games, Switch emulation, it's going to be closer to that 3 to 4 hour range, which I think is still pretty solid for a handheld this size. Now let's look at some performance benchmarks, and for testing I use Geekbench and 3D Wildlife, and we're going to be comparing the results of the RP5 to the RP Mini, the 865 in the Galaxy S20, and the Retroid Pocket 4 because all of these are devices that I benchmarked in my RP Mini review, which if you haven't seen, go check that one out because I did go pretty in depth on that one, and some of that stuff is going to be relevant to what we're seeing here. For Geekbench, the RP Mini performed better in both single and multi-core, but it's not a huge gap in single core, so emulation impact should be minimal, but it's interesting to see that there's a difference. On the GPU side, if we look at the Vulkan scores, the 5 actually performs better than the Mini by about 100 points. So I think the performance profiles are optimized differently between the Mini and the 5, but that's just my somewhat semi-educated guess, and I could be wrong about that. I do want to point out though that even though it's getting beat currently by the Mini, it's still doing a lot better than the stock 865 and the D1100 and the 4 Pro. And like I said in my Mini review, when it comes out to what these devices can emulate, single core performance is still going to be the most important thing. Moving on to the Wildlife test, the RP Mini again comes out on top in all 3 settings. This could be because of the larger display having to push more pixels, but I can't really say that 100%. Moving on to stability, it seems that no matter what setting I've used, the smart profile was more than enough to keep temperatures in control and the device is running pretty stable, so you should be able to just set it at that and just leave it. Retroid's been very open about the fact that Android 13 just wasn't ready just yet, so they had to push the release back a little bit, which I think is the right call based on what we're seeing here. Now once we get those updates and everything is finalized, the RP Mini and the 5 should pretty much perform the same, except in 3D Wildlife, which I think the screen is playing a role in there just because we have more pixels to push, it's a higher resolution display. That could be the case, but I might be wrong and it might just be an Android 13 issue. We really won't know until that's finalized. However, based on the numbers I'm seeing, it really won't impact emulation all that much, especially because we can cap the resolution. So if you're running a game at a 2x resolution in the RP Mini for Gamecube, let's say, you should pretty much get the same performance on the RP5 even though the scores weren't as good just because their resolution is capped, so that higher resolution screen doesn't have to get as many pixels pushed to it. However, all that said, there is still something funny going on with the GPU, which I'll cover a little bit more when we get into the actual game testing, but for now let's talk about the hardware. I got the all black model and I couldn't be happier. This is the one I wanted because the screen just blends into the front panel, so if you're playing something with black bars like GBA or Super Nintendo, they pretty much disappear. The display is beautiful. It's hard to really show how good a screen looks on video, but visually, it really doesn't get much better than this. The colors look great from any viewing angle, and thanks to the high resolution, things look really nice and sharp. I think a lot of us immediately thought of the Anbernic 556 when we found out the 5 was going to have an AMOLED panel. And in my opinion, this screen actually looks a little bit better. Don't get me wrong, the screen on the 556 is great, but I kind of like the colors on the RP5 just a little bit more. And if you're a fan of using shaders, it seems like this one doesn't have any of the issues the Mini is having, so have fun with those. Speaking of the Mini, the RP5 is obviously bigger. It's actually really similar in size to the 4 Pro, but the ergonomic bumps make it a little bit thicker. It's almost the same size as the Odin 2 Mini, and even at the thickest points, they're pretty much even. The RP5 is just lighter and more comfortable in my opinion. Ergonomically, it feels good. Just like with the Mini, the bumps add comfort without making it too bulky, and the curved design makes the bumpers and triggers really comfortable to use. The only issues I've had so far are playing games that require you to hit Y and B at the same time, like Mario or Hades, because you end up bumping the right stick a little bit. That, and for first-person shooters, the sticks feel a little bit short. This was a pretty easy fix for me just by adding some Vita caps to give them a little bit more height, and after doing that, I haven't really thought about them, which is exactly what you want. But to be fair, even without the caps, it's still fine. If you want a handheld to be compact, some compromises have to be made. I'm just being nitpicky because that's kind of part of reviewing a handheld. As I've said before, I'm a huge fan of the D-pad being up top, so I'm really happy with that placement. It's the same clicky Vita style D-pad Retroid normally uses. It's solid and feels very precise. You won't have any issues pulling off fighting moves or playing precision platformers like Celeste. There's only one thing I don't like about it, and that's that the circle cutout around the buttons is bigger than the one around the D-pad, and that bothers me because I can't unsee it, and now neither can you. The analog sticks are again the usual Retroid style we've come to expect. They have a nice range of motion, no snapping, and feel smooth. I wish they were a little bit taller and more inset, but I don't think the screen panel is going to allow for that. The buttons feel good. They're a big improvement from the ones in the Mini. These are way quieter. They're slightly rounded around the edges and have what I think is kind of the perfect amount of travel for a handheld this size. On the rest of the front of the device, we have select, start, home, back, and 2 front-facing speakers. On the top, we have our power and volume rockers. We also have textured L1, R1 bumpers and analog triggers. And finally, on the back, we have our textured ergonomic grips and the vents. Moving on from all the buttons and stuff, let's check out the speakers. And please adjust your volume accordingly because it's gonna get loud. The speakers are pretty solid. They might be a little bit echoey when you really push them, but I don't think most people are going to crank them up as high as they can go, so it really shouldn't be an issue. It is great that they're front facing because that just makes them that much better, but I don't think these are anything special. They're just a good solid pair of speakers. Now the last hardware component I want to mention is going to be the fans. Now in sports mode, it is a little bit loud, not as bad as the RP Mini, but you can still hear it. But if you put it in quiet or smart mode, you really won't even notice it. Smart mode does a good job of keeping temperatures pretty stable without ramping up too much, and I mostly just keep it there. But you could probably just keep it in quiet mode because I never felt like the device was getting hot or thought that it might be an issue. So the lower profiles are probably going to be fine for almost every use. I love the build of the RP5, and I'm really happy we don't have to do any mods or anything like that to make it better. But if you're like me and you like getting into DIY projects, make sure to check out this video sponsored, PCBway. Whether you're a hobbyist or a pro working on custom electronics or looking for high quality 3D printing, PCBway has you covered. They offer an easy to use service where you can design and order custom PCBs with a quick turnaround. They also support small runs, which is great for personal projects or prototypes. The best part, their online platform lets you upload your design and select from tons of options. They even do assembly if you need it. So if you're in the market for reliable PCB manufacturing or just wanting to start a new project, make sure to check out PCBway. There's a link down below to get you started. For now, let's talk about software. The 5 is running on Android 13 and it's a little bit buggy. I haven't had any UI crashes or anything like that, but I've had some hiccups when switching between some apps. For the most part, the UI stuff is done and the built-in tools are ready to use, so let's take a quick look at that. If you just want to get things going, the setup wizard can get you started with some pre-installed emulators. Personally, I like to install my own, and I'd recommend you do that as well because it's going to give you some better performance. But it is nice that the option for the pre-installed emulators is available. From the drop-down menu, you can control things like controller type, fan and performance profiles, LED lights, and the floating icon. This one is pretty useful because it opens up a side menu for things like a screen mapper, FPS tracker, RAM use, temperature, and a key tester. I'm not going to cover the launcher or dock mode because those are still being worked on, but I'll just say, video out does work, the audio just doesn't route to the external display. The other missing things are battery life in sleep mode, optimized fast charging, and some video codecs for streaming, so I won't really be talking about those today. That's why earlier in the review I was saying I will be doing an update video later on. But for now, let's talk about Linux. Since the 865 can boot into Linux, we now have two options, Rocknix and Batocera. And development is much further than I thought. Most things seem to work fine, there's even touch support for joysticks, so this is very promising. Gamecube and PS2 seem to work well, and there's always the option to jump back into Android for the games that start to struggle. There's even support for original Xbox games, but don't get too excited about those yet because performance is still a work in progress. Even high-end handheld PCs struggle with Xbox emulation, so manage your expectations. And keep in mind, we're running the ARM version of Linux, so we're not actually running this app natively. About half of the Xbox games I tried either didn't boot or were pretty much a slideshow, but Halo was kinda playable, so there's definitely potential here. What Linux does offer right now is a nice interface with native Pico 8 and Portmaster support. That could eventually give the RP5 a fantastic docking experience. The cool thing is, you can actually use the same SD card for both Android and Linux, since Android does recognize the ext4 format Rocknix is using. Unfortunately, doing this means you won't be able to plug your SD card into your Windows PC, but if you have a Linux PC, you can just plug the RP5 in Android mode and plug that into your Windows PC so that you can drop your games in that way. This is really cool because now you can have a dual boot system with all your games without having to swap cards. Right now, both Rocknix and Batocera are still in beta, but once we have an official release, I'll make sure to come back and cover them. For now, let's go look at some Android games. You're going to be able to run pretty much any Android game you want. There's plenty of power here for even the most demanding games to reach a pretty steady 60 FPS with decent graphical settings. And thanks to the active cooling, you can have pretty long play sessions without having to worry about any performance drops or throttling or anything like that. A huge plus is that this screen just makes games look really good. So even though most of us are getting these devices for emulation, don't sleep on the selection of games on Android. Retroid has some awesome videos on Android games, so be sure to check him out for some ideas. A lot of games have native controller support, and for the ones that don't, there's a screen mapper, so no worries. Personally, I go through little stretches where I get hooked on Call of Duty Mobile, and this is a really good way to enjoy that game. Now let's look at emulation. There's a few issues with the higher end stuff that I'm confident will get fixed with an update, so just keep it in mind for later on. All of the easier to run systems like GBA, SNES, N64, and Dreamcast run and look awesome. So if that's mostly what you're after, you're gonna have a great time playing all of those 8, 16, and 32-bit systems. PSP games are definitely a highlight, and I know we're kind of at a point now where PSP really isn't all that hard to run on Android thanks to how good PPS is PPS, but it just looks so good I wanted to include it. For example, God of War Chains of Olympus runs at a steady 60 at a 6x resolution. Yes, that's overkill for this screen, but it just goes to show that you can pretty much run whatever PSP game you want on this. Saturn gets talked about a lot when it comes to emulation, and I've said multiple times I'm really not a huge Saturn fan. It's just not one I grew up with, but it's one that I have been trying to explore a lot more as I've gotten older. If you're familiar with emulation, you know Saturn is very hard to emulate, but because we have such a powerful chip here, you can actually run these games using the Beetle Saturn core and RetroArch, which is pretty demanding. And even throw some shaders if you want them to look nicer, because these games only run at native resolution using that core. Now, I can't tell you every single Saturn game is going to run perfectly, but every game I tried ran at a steady 60 without any major issues, so I'm pretty confident you're going to have a good time with Saturn if that's something you want to emulate on this. Now moving on to something a little bit more modern, we have the 3DS, and it looks awesome on this screen. Yes, you still have to deal with the dual screens, but because we have a wider display, you can pretty much make it work. There's also enough power here to run pretty much every 3DS game at least a 3x resolution. There will be some outliers, but for the most part, you should be able to do at least that. And I know there's an argument that the best way to play 3DS games are still on an original 3DS, and sure, I get that, but personally, I think having higher resolution and dual sticks is way better than the low resolution screens on the 3DS and having that nub. Now let's get into the systems most people are here for, starting off with the Gamecube. This one's going to mostly run at a 2x resolution or higher depending on the game, and if you're mostly into first party games like Mario and Zelda, you're going to have a pretty good time without any major issues. The same goes for most third-party titles. Most of them should run fine, but you will have to go in and make some adjustments. That's just how it is with emulation. Even on something more powerful like the Odin 2, not everything's going to run perfectly out of the box. One thing I do want to make special mention of is that I noticed some weird graphical issues with Dolphin that I didn't see in the mini, like the grass on gun being the wrong color. The game still runs fine, but the grass is not the color it should be, so it looks like it's a texture issue. This also happens on the Wii since it's using the same emulator. Not all games have it, as you can see from the footage, but since it wasn't happening before, it makes me think it's a problem with the Android 13 build and something that could get fixed with an update. That aside for now, the 865 has enough power to run a lot of Gamecube and Wii games at a 2 to 3x resolution, as long as you can get the motion controls mapped. This should also be a pretty solid PS2 machine. Most games I've tested worked fine, but you will have to tweak a couple settings in games like Jak and Daxter to fix some rendering issues. But that's pretty much the case with any device, again including the Odin 2, which is kind of the benchmark for Android emulation right now. However, with more demanding games like Sly Cooper, I did get some hard dips in some areas, so I had to switch back and forth between Vulkan and OpenCL to get it running. It was still pretty playable, just not as smooth as I would have liked. Overall, this device should handle most PS2 games, but it's definitely going to need some tweaks to get everything running. Moving on to a system I've never covered on Android, we have the WiiU. Now, don't expect to run Breath of the Wild or Xenoblade X on here, but it's really cool that we can actually get Wii U games on a handheld this small. It's still pretty early in development, but some pretty big titles like Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess, and Mario Kart seems to work fine, with only some minor graphical issues. Mostly things like some missing textures or some artifacts here and there. The only downside is you do have to deal with some stuttering, but that does go away after you play the game for a little bit. It's just the shader caching that you can't really get around on systems like this one. Sure, most of the best Wii U games are already on the Switch, but we still don't have Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD, and those are the definitive versions of those games. So it is pretty cool that we can actually get Wii U games on an Android handheld, and it's always awesome to see Cemu get more love, because honestly, the Wii U deserved better. And now, finally, thanks to Android 13, we can talk about Switch emulation. And if there ever was a case for how much better emulation can be on a Snapdragon chip, it's pretty much this system. No, the 5 isn't the Odin 2, and we don't have a super high-end chip like the 8 Gen 2, but you can get a lot of games to work, even games you wouldn't expect. Now, I wouldn't recommend getting an RP5 specifically for Switch emulation, but it does a pretty decent job and really expands the library of what it can play. It's not perfect, I've definitely had some issues, but all in all, I've had a reasonably good experience with it. But I mostly go for lighter games, so if you really want to get something for Switch games, my advice is just get a Switch and mod it. That's going to be the best way to go about it. Even with the current state of the RP5, I still love the device. I reach for it all the time and I just want to keep using it. And it's not just one of those where I'm reviewing it so I have to play with it. I generally look forward to using it. The Dpad being where it's at, the screen size, the size of the device, all of it is just kind of the perfect package for what I want out of an Android device, but it's not ready for retail. And that's something Retroid recognized, so they pushed back the shipping date. And I think, again, I said this earlier, that was the right call. I just think that if you're paying $200+ for a handheld, you should get a finished product. And right now, it's not quite there. Now, if you're an early adopter, I'm sure you're going to be perfectly fine, even if that update doesn't come in time. I'm sure Retroid is going to get that out, but until they do, I can't fully endorse it for the everyday user because I know some people aren't going to be okay with some of the hiccups that they're going to come across. All that being said, I still think this is one of the best handhelds we've seen in 2024, and just in general, this is a great device and it's only going to get better. But if you haven't ordered yet, maybe wait a little bit longer and see if the update does come out before the shipping date. But what do you think? Are you going to pick one up? Did you already get one? How do you feel about the Retroid Pocket 5? Let me know down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you on the next one.